This is Mission Possible Inclusive Capitalism, the podcast show that fixes economic inequality, economically empowers Main Street, and has a little fun along the way. Hello, I'm Katherine, and welcome to today's episode with our special guest, Martin Wolf, who points out that, and I quote directly, capitalism is broken. We're going to explore some pivotal concepts such as, what is the true purpose of capitalism? What is the true purpose and obligations of a publicly listed company? And is capitalism supposed to be sociopathic? Martin is chief economics commentator at the Financial Times. He was awarded the CBE, that's Commander of the British Empire, for his work. He knows all significant central bankers around the world. His readers are the top decision makers in the world, and his friends include the likes of the former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner, one of Wall Street's leading investors Mohammed El-Erian, and central banker Mervyn King. But he is also notorious for his op-eds in which he sharply criticises them. Former Secretary of the US Treasury Larry Summers calls him the most deeply thoughtful and professionally informed economic journalist in the world. Harvard economist Ken Rogoff said he really is the premier financial and economics writer in the world. So here are some quotes from Martin's columns. At a speech for the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a coalition of the largest shareholders in the world, Martin said, "If companies are allowed to make the maximisation of shareholder value their sole goal, they can and will argue that they are obliged to do whatever they can expect to get away with. But those are the values of a psychopath. They would destroy the trust on which civilised society is built." Society has given the corporate form important privileges. In return, society has a right to expect decency. Ethical restraints must be internalised, even if they are against the interests of shareholders, for the good of society as a whole. In the words of the American writer H.L. Mencken, to every complex problem there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. The governance of corporations is an extremely complex problem because of their nature. Shareholder value maximisation and shareholder control are clear and relatively simple answers to that problem. Unfortunately, they are also wrong. For me, one of the most key points of Martin's work is he talks about how companies must put purpose first, not profit. By the way, CEO Larry Fink of BlackRock, which is the world's largest investment manager, managing $6 trillion worth of assets, has also said the same. This is a crucial point for us. For ethical reasons that we'll go into in another episode, it was clear that the ethically appropriate model for our entity was a social enterprise. A social enterprise is a hybrid model combining the best of both the NGO model, with its social mission coming first, and the for-profit model, thus ensuring financial sustainability and enabling the social mission. And the social mission comes first and foremost. Our social mission is 1. To reverse economic inequality and to make capitalism work for all, not just the few. And 2. To economically re-empower Main Street. So I wanted to show you that an entity does not have to be a non-profit to be able to put purpose first. Martin talks about how capitalism is broken and how we therefore need to be very creative and aggressively experiment in trying new models in order to fix it. And that's essentially what we're doing. In fact, it's very hard to do this from the perspective of running a business and thinking in terms of business models. Recently, for example, I was asked by somebody at the conference board, "What is my business model?" To which I responded, "If you're using the status quo inputs, you're going to get status quo outputs. In other words, you can't change what we currently have using tools and models that we're currently using. In fact, I'm only able to do this work and implement this mission by engaging my creative training and my background in the arts. And I'm actually drawing from the British artist Andy Goldsworthy as a cognitive framework. He uses nature as his palette and canvas. I'm using capitalism and, well, I suppose Wall Street as mine." But this is actually a crucial point and something that Ned Phelps, Nobel laureate economist, talks about, and that is the importance of the liberal arts and liberal art degrees in terms of enabling innovation and creativity. Innovation and creativity are in fact the core engine of long-term sustainable economic growth, and it is in fact this importance of creative minds that is entirely missing on Wall Street and in business schools. Just a few other housekeeping points before we launch in. We need to define externalities and internalizing. So Martin writes that, for example, ethical restraints must be internalized and inflicting negative externalities. So what is a negative externality? It is a cost inflicted on an outside party that is not a party to a transaction or economic activity and hence has no control over whether or not that activity or transaction happens. So, for example, that outside party then has a cost imposed upon them without any benefit, etc. A good example of this recently is an oil and gas company which is drilling a well just 300 yards from a school. So a company should then correct for these negative externalities by internalizing those costs. In other words, taking responsibility for those costs. So think of, say, a manufacturer polluting a river, poisoning the drinking water for the local community, etc. The company needs to clean up its pollution so that the health of the local community does not suffer. Another term that we need to very quickly define is leverage and deleveraging. Leverage is essentially how much debt you have funding a company. And in essence, the greater the debt, the riskier the business. Because while gains are magnified during the good times, losses are also magnified during the bad times. And greater losses is hugely disruptive of jobs. So on an economy-wide basis, this means you'll have massive unemployment during economic downturns. It's really inappropriate, in other words. Martin, you talk of the business corporation being among the most remarkable of all human innovations. What was so great about it? And why was the business corporation invented? To generate and maximise profits for shareholders or for some other rationale? Why did legislators allow for limited liability companies?
Well, the big answer, before we go into all the historical parts, is that in order to run a complex economy, it has turned out that we need really large and quite complicated institutions. Small family businesses cannot manage large capital-intensive activities that require either very long time periods to work or that require huge factories or huge investments in long-term trade. And we've actually been doing things like this in a more limited way, even going back to the Roman Empire, also in the medieval period. But perhaps the real beginning of the idea of a corporation we can identify was with the East India companies of the Netherlands and the UK. And the reason was these were institutions that were required to manage trade across immense distances and time. Once the Industrial Revolution began, the need for this became vastly greater because the really important characteristic of the Industrial Revolution was the capacity for the first time, the invention of the possibility of enormous capital investment, enormous factories in order to achieve the productivity that industrialization made possible. And that required an institution of exceptional scale, therefore required pooling the capital of many, many people. Individual wealthy people didn't have enough money to actually make these work. And this is why you had the joint stock company, that's companies in which there were many, many different shareholders. And in addition, in order to persuade people to put up the capital in businesses they couldn't directly control in the way that a small family business could be controlled, they needed to limit the liability of shareholders. If they had completely limitless liability for a business that they didn't control, nobody would put up the money. And without that, we wouldn't have had large corporations at all. And without large corporations, starting in the middle of the 19th century, much of the innovation and development of the last 150, 160, 170 years would clearly never have happened.
Why does innovation matter so much? And don't we have enough innovation in the economy already? And surely it's not the purpose of big corporations to innovate because, to quote what many leading investment managers on Wall Street have said to me, corporations are just so bad at innovating, so they should just buy it in instead. In other words, acquire small startups, etc.
I think it would be helpful if we differentiated different aspects of innovation. What does innovation actually mean? And to some degree, this might have changed a little in the recent past, but we've got over the last 2 centuries, the Industrial Revolution is clearly the sort of decisive watershed in human economic history. We have some experience with what innovation means and how it works. And this is a very crude, but nonetheless, I think, useful way of thinking about it. When wholly new industries emerge, doing things that have never been done before, and there have been repeated examples of that. The railway is an example, civil aviation is another, the chemical industry is another, the electrical industry is another, the computer industry is another, the automobile industry is another. Many examples. The modern information technology industry is yet another example. These were completely new industries when they started. They tended, therefore, to be started by very few exceptions, completely new companies. Indeed, just as the people you talked to describe, these new companies often created by people who are both inventors and entrepreneurs. Thomas Edison is probably the most famous example in American history, the creator of the modern electrical industry. So these people create new businesses. In his case, he created General Electric, which went on to dominate this industry for 1.5 centuries, pretty well since then. So that's how fundamental innovation tends to occur. But once an industry has been established, then a great deal of the follow-on innovation, the constant improvement, if you like, in what it does, occurs within the firm. And that tends to mean that they dominate really endless process of improvement, which is something we take so much for granted, we don't even think about it, but it's a completely normal part of how our economies work. Now, it is also true that some of those improvements do come from smaller companies that are created outside the big ones. And there's a very big question about whether the big ones should be allowed to buy these smaller companies, or these smaller companies should actually be protected, be allowed to become big too. But we are fairly familiar with this idea, very obvious now in digital technology and biotechnology, that quite a few of the innovations are in the smaller companies. But as I said, in most established industries, and you can see it pretty clearly even in the digital industries today, a very large part of the innovation and endless improvement is coming from established large companies because they have the resources, they have the financial resources, the capital resources, the human skills to keep things moving forward, to be endlessly improving them. Just think about aircraft. We're constantly improving aircraft a bit. The cumulative differences over time are really quite substantial, and nobody but Boeing or Airbus have the resources and the knowledge to do that. And that's a very, very important part of the whole innovation process in our economies.
I want to tie this also to what economist Ronald Coase said, which was, the market is a less efficient way of organising production than a hierarchical organisation because of transaction costs. Clay Christensen and Derek Van Beaver at Harvard Business School have also pointed this out.
That is exactly the point I was making. I've been very influenced by the work of the late William Baumol, one of America's greatest economists, who did a lot of work on how innovation works. He made essentially 2 crucial points. The first was, if we look at economic growth, as we can measure it, improvements in living standards we've enjoyed, the overwhelming bulk of that comes from innovation, from doing new things or doing old things in a new way. So innovation is the central part of the growth process. And if you believe economic growth has any value at all, then innovation is what it's about. And even if you're just interested in improving the environment, we are clearly very, very interested in getting companies to do this. The second point William Baumol made is, if you actually look where this cumulative innovation occurs, a very large part of the less visible part of that comes from these huge companies. So to give you just one sort of simple example, there's been an enormous improvement in the energy efficiency of standard appliances. things like refrigerators and washing machines and things of this kind. Now, these have often been forced by regulation, and rightly so, but the people who made all the refrigerators in the world, as it were, the big companies that we're all familiar with, were the only people who had the resources, the motivation, the production lines to actually do that. And that's an incredibly important part of the innovative process in our economies. And Balmer's conclusion was, therefore, not only that innovation is the core of what our economies do, but also it is something we're not just focusing on the few spectacular breakthroughs that lead to a completely new industry, like creating the personal computer in the case of Apple. But if we don't look at that and we look at the more routine but central parts of innovation, and I've given you some example, it's the big companies essentially that do it, not the small, and certainly not the mom and pop stores, and not even with very few exceptions, the exciting innovation in a garage.
But let's quantify this for a moment. If you take the S&P 500, for example, and say, well, about 2/3 of it, or much of it, is in ex-growth sectors such as banks, autos, retail, etc., you can't afford to say that this big chunk of the S&P 500 just doesn't need to prioritise innovation, because what you're then doing is essentially hugely diminishing long-term growth prospects of the S&P 500, and thereby a huge slug of the economy.
Well, actually, I think if any of the companies in those sectors thought that they could ignore innovation, they would find, I think in all the examples you've given, that in the not too distant future, 10, 15 years, they will be wiped out. So the retail industry has seen quite extraordinary innovations in the last 30 years. Obviously, the most obvious example of that is the rise of the internet retailers, Amazon first and foremost. The retailers that dominated the US when I lived there 40 years ago have, I think, virtually without exception disappeared. And they disappeared because somebody came along with a model for operating the retail business, which used the latest technology and was more convenient for people who didn't have lots of time to go and shop. So that's an example of an industry which you might think retail, that's not very exciting. But in fact, there's been extraordinary innovation. You mentioned automobiles as another very interesting case because, of course, there's a long controversial history in which it's alleged that automobile industries haven't been as innovative as they should have been. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. It's clear that in the West, the demand for motor vehicles, the expansion of the motor vehicle fleet is at an end. We've got probably as many cars as we're ever going to have, possibly far more than we're going to have in the future.
Let's talk about sociopathy. The public would view capitalism as innately sociopathic. Is this true? Or is the problem that the mantra of maximising shareholder value is sociopathic?
I think this is a very, very difficult issue. Obviously, if you go back to commercial life before the modern economy, before the modern corporation, you have small businesses, family businesses in many cases. And as a business, you would in those circumstances have a responsibility, and one would say it's in your interest too, to treat your customers fairly, treat your workers fairly, in the sense that you give them what they expect to get, that it meets the quality standards they might have expected. And similarly, you treat your workers decently, otherwise they won't stay with you. That wasn't quite clearly always the case. Indeed, very far from it, and regulations hardly existed. But what you wouldn't have expected is these small family businesses to have a huge responsibility, a sense of responsibility for the consequences of their actions upon society at large. They had more limited obligations to be law-abiding, to be decent, but not to have responsibilities for what was going on in society as a whole, on the whole. Now, we move from this to the modern corporation. And I think everything that I've said that would have been expected of family businesses should quite obviously also be expected of the company. Again, a lot of this never happened, but that was clearly the obligation. Now, the sociopathic problem arises if the corporation, which now has a capacity to affect society because of its scale, which is orders of magnitude greater than a small competitive business in a competitive market, if that business now says, well, the wider social consequences of what we do are of no concern to us, that's for somebody else to deal with, then that does feel sociopathic. because of the power they have. And then that raises, of course, the really profound question, how far can one internalize in the operation of a corporation the obligation to take account, and how should it do so, of the wider social impact of what they do? And I think there are some areas where we would be much clearer that they have obligations to do so. For instance, dumping poisonous effluent or anything like that. Clearly, absolutely their responsibility not to do so. Now, it seems to me, the case that if you say that a corporation's dominant obligation is simply to make profits, its only real concern should be what happens to shareholders, and everything else is purely instrumental. Its relations with its workers, its relations with the regions in which it operates, purely instrumental for the purposes of making profits for shareholders, then inevitably those other concerns, which are legitimate concerns, should be part of the objectives of the corporations, will be downplayed and will disappear. And because of the scale of corporations and the damage they can do, the results could be very, very harmful. So I would argue there are very profound questions which are really not easy to answer, exactly how far their social obligations go and how they should trade off different aspects of their social obligations. So that, I think, is a deep set of dilemmas. But I also think it's true that by emphasizing this one overriding obligation above all other obligations, namely to make the greatest amount of money, the overwhelming likelihood is that they will ignore other concerns which are immensely significant. With the sort of economy we now have, in which a limited number of large companies have enormous effects, you just can't, I think, ignore the wider social consequences of such a simplistic set of obligations. So there are some very difficult issues here, but I'm reasonably convinced that saying that a company's essentially sole role is to make money is potentially highly damaging for society.
Does the corporation just owe an obligation not to harm society, or does it have a greater obligation to actively contribute to the well-being of society? And if so, what sort of benefit? For example, Mike Porter at Harvard Business School recently argued that the purpose of corporations is to solve society's greatest problems.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, that's why we created the companies, or at least you would want corporations to solve some of them, the ones that corporations can solve. I don't think I want them to solve all social problems. There would then be no role for governments or civil society or anything else. And I think these entities clearly have enormous role. So I don't want to exaggerate what corporations can do. I certainly agree the broad proposition corporations exist to solve social problems. There are problems that they might be able to solve in ways that I can't even imagine. And there are problems that they might well solve if we were more imaginative about creating markets.
Let's talk about looting. Adam Smith was concerned about agents looting companies. What would he say about today's obsession with buybacks, financial engineering, cost-cutting, rationalization as core strategy, squeezing workers, in other words, instead of investing in long-term innovation and workers as assets, which is Bill Lazanick's core thesis? What would Adam Smith say then if we brought him back to life today? What would Adam Smith say about Milton Friedman? And surely didn't Milton Friedman come up with a pretty reasonable response to the agency problem, the conflict of interest between managers and owners?
I wish I knew. I think Adam Smith, if he came back, would really be astonished by our economy. It would be so extraordinarily different from anything he had imagined. He was a great philosopher and a great thinker, but the world he thought about and was in his bones, the world of the 18th century, is incredibly remote from ours. His view, as written, was that the problem with setting up a joint stock company, as we discussed at the beginning, by bringing together capital from so many different sources, introducing limited liability, and then putting managers in charge, would create a series of incentive problems. One, I think, which certainly did worry him, is limited liability itself, namely the shareholders would not feel very responsible because their costs, their losses were capped. They could only lose their invested capital. They couldn't lose any more. And of course, the other one was the incentive problem was between the owners and the management. And he would certainly feel, looking at the world now, that despite our quite astonishing economic achievements, he would say we really haven't solved these problems at all. Now, his biggest concern would have been with the second agency problem between owners and managers. And if that was the main concern you had, then the Milton Friedman solution might have seemed to him a not unreasonable solution. It gets rid of the problem that managers are not reflecting the interests of owners. But he would also say, I think, well, but that's not the main incentive problem we have here. The main incentive problem we have here is that these huge companies are being run for the interests of shareholders who have very limited stake in the company, no real capacity to oversee its operation, and whose risks are very carefully protected by limited liability. So it is simply not true that the principal incentive problem or agency problem lies between the owners and the managers. The really big incentive problem, I think he would say, is actually between the owners and society, or the owners, other stakeholders in the company. We've discussed some of them, workers and so forth, suppliers and so forth, and also society as a whole. If that is your agency problem or the problem of defective incentives, then the Milton Friedman solution isn't a solution at all, because it only deals with one and far from the most important of the agency or incentive problems associated with the creation of the company. And I think Adam Smith would have been flexible enough to say, well, as a matter of fact, this is a clever solution to a rather unimportant problem. The unimportant problem is the agency problem between owners and managers. The really important problem is the agency problem between everybody else and the owners.
In your ICGN speech, you defined the purpose of a corporation as to create economic value without creating harm to society, or to quote you more precisely, without inflicting negative externalities. How should we rethink the purpose of corporations within the context of economic inequality, defining that as workers receiving no pay increase net of inflation over the last 25 or so years, and receiving a declining share of corporate profits thanks to key corporate strategy focusing on rationalisation, cost-cutting, squeezing workers' costs in order to drive near-term profits? Does economic inequality and stagnant wages classify as a harm to society and negative externalities?
I think it's perfectly reasonable to regard it as an externality in the sense that it's a social impact if everybody does it, which is not internalized by individual decision makers, because they will not think of themselves as determining the distributional outcomes for the whole of society by any decision they make individually. And in a competitive market with shareholder control and shareholder value maximization, they will feel they have no choice but to pursue policies that in aggregate will lead to this outcome. So that's a fairly classic externality in its form, even though it's within the market rather than, as with an environmental externality, outside the market. And it raises the same sort of problems as most externalities do, which is that if you want corporations to change their behavior, you have to find some measure or measures which change all of them simultaneously by changing the environment in which they operate. It can't be done by simply telling them you should individually behave differently, because they will argue with some reason that if they behave differently, they're going to be driven out of business, or if they're not, they're going to be taken over by some other set of managers who will operate in a different way. So it raises system-wide issues, and like all these things, therefore it requires a system-wide change. That change would have to apply to all of them, or at least most of them. If we are to fix this externality, then it won't be resolved by the actions of one company. You'd have to change the context in which they work, and that will involve some large structural shift of some kind, either within the economy itself spontaneously or in the form of a government intervention or interventions.
You've talked about how under the shareholder primacy model, the purpose of a corporation is essentially to serve the interests of those least committed to the corporation. Can you explain why shareholders have a far lesser commitment to a corporation than its other stakeholders, such as workers, etc., and the relative risk profiles of employees and suppliers versus shareholders?
So the crucial point is when a company ceases to be owned by a very limited number of founders and initial investors, usually a relatively limited number, and it becomes a public company with widely owned shareholding, and therefore a very widely distributed register of shareholders, the nature of ownership changes in quite profound ways. The individual shareholder, in this case, often owns the shares through a mutual fund or some vehicle of that kind, possibly an indexed fund. None of these are large enough owners of a company to have a real stake in its management. There are large collective action problems involved for any of them in trying to interfere in management because it's a large cost and most of the return accrues to other shareholders, so they don't usually bother. And of course, one of the purposes of public markets is that they should be highly liquid, so people can feel if something goes wrong with the company or looks like going wrong, they can sell out very easily, and indeed they do. And of course, shareholders are also increasingly encouraged to hold a very wide, very large number of different companies, shares in a very large number of different companies, possibly just in proportion with their value in the market. So the whole stock market in index form. In this situation, and for these reasons, the commitment of individual share owners to any given company is minimal. If they see a problem with it, they will sell out or can sell out. They're very well insured against the risks associated with an individual company because it represents a very small part of their portfolio. And so essentially, they're not really bearing very much risk associated with the ownership of the company. This is quite different from the worker whose income might depend entirely on the job he or she has with that company. It's very different from a location where possibly a particular plant owned by the company is the only or the main employer in that location. These are risks of concentrated exposure which can not be diversified really at all. So the shareholder in a widely owned public company is in a very favorable position in terms of being able to insure against the risks associated with that company, and in terms of the ability to unload that risk if it looks at all dangerous. It's a completely different position from the worker or other stakeholders, and a much more favorable one.
But shareholders would say, wait a minute, Martin, employees are rewarded for their risk via their salaries and benefits.
Well, there are two separate points. They are rewarded for the work they do. That is clearly true. But the concentration of risk that they bear, which is an inevitable consequence of the fact that you can't really work for 20 companies at the same time, these are actually risks it is impossible to insure against in the market because it's the nature of human capital that it's owned by the individual. It's his or her own human capital, and it can be only employed in one employer at a time. Now, of course, it is conceivable, perhaps even likely in some cases, if they lose that job, they might find another one, but there will be large costs involved with that search. And there's really no way at all in the market that they can insure themselves against the risk of loss associated with this concentrated portfolio, if you like, of human capital activity. So they are in a completely different situation from the shareholder in terms of their ability to insure against the risks associated with the particular job that they have.
Let's talk about the purpose of a corporation. You wrote that, quoting Oxford University's Professor Colin Mayer, if a business substitutes making money for purpose, it will fail at both. Why is this? If Corporation A decides that it wants to generate profits and figures out how to make a product or a service to sell in order to make profits, why will that necessarily fail? And what about the investment banks or the active equity investment management firms that are clearly in it to make a profit first and foremost, and yet failing at what should be their purpose, beating the benchmark, while charging huge fees, and thereby generating the most lucrative operating margins across the economy? Also, I know many pension fund CIOs who would say that they precisely want companies that they own to make as much money money as possible. So how do you convince them otherwise?
So this has several different aspects. So clearly there are some businesses whose aim is to make money, and they do so to some degree. This is most obviously true of people in the financial sector. Now, even there, one could argue that by simply aiming at the purpose of making money, with a few exceptions, maybe some hedge funds, purely speculative entities. But if you look at banks, or including investment banks, the evidence suggests the return that entities that are aimed predominantly just at making money rather than at serving their clients as well as they can, that really internalize fiduciary duty to their clients, that those entities really have actually returned very poor returns to shareholders. They returned pretty good returns to their top employees. So there's a real agency problem associated with these businesses. But the evidence I've seen in the past is that over the long haul, these businesses have not returned good returns to shareholders. And the reason for that is that for some years, they can look as though they are by taking ever greater risks, which are concealed in their balance sheet. Then it blows up. They have large losses for various reasons, and the shareholders bear those losses. And the shareholders, being outsiders, don't fully understand the consequences of the profit-seeking behavior of the entity. So even with those businesses which you would think of as predominantly profit-oriented, banks, financial institutions more broadly, it's not at all clear that that objective, rather than the objective of serving their customers and their clients as well as possible and making profits the byproduct of that, is actually a very sensible one. But if you go beyond those businesses to businesses whose objectives, whose value proposition really rests on providing a range of very valuable goods and services to customers, there's pretty good reason to believe that if they focus on that, this motivates their employees. It motivates innovation, which is aimed at providing that valuable good or service. And in the process, this business invests a lot, it innovates a lot, and ultimately it delivers not only success in the market because it satisfies its customers and suppliers very well, but it also delivers profits because it becomes very successful. But there's some evidence that as companies become predominantly companies whose main activities are not money-making per se, shift away from their objective of innovation, technical excellence, satisfying customers with first-rate products, and shift to essentially a profit-oriented focus and examining that and are evaluating that way, that they deteriorate in terms of their primary purpose and, as a result, also in the profitability. One might suggest that the fate of General Electric, GE, one of the greatest companies in the world over the last 30 years, is evidence of this really very large proposition. So I think it's clear that people do well in business by devoting themselves to the purpose of that business as a business, not to the money that the business will generate.
So Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, the largest investment management firm in the world, recently put out his latest annual letter urging corporations to focus on prioritising purpose, not just profit. Do you see any of this actually changing much when in the meantime mainstream investment management firms every day are urging CEOs to focus on rationalisation as strategy, in other words cost-cutting and squeezing workers, financial engineering and other drivers of short-term profit growth?
I'm not convinced effectively there's not much difference that can be made by any one of them. It has to be system-wide. It may be if a number of asset managers move in the same direction, this will be very helpful, but I think ultimately there's a powerful limit to what he can achieve by these sorts of statements.
You wrote back in June 2007 that the new financial capitalism represents the triumph of the trader in assets over the long-term producer. And Professor Colin Mayer at Oxford University wrote that the corporation is a rent extraction vehicle for the shortest term shareholders. But the largest pension funds have said to me, well, yes, that's great. That's how they make their returns and pay their current liabilities. So can you critique the pension funds?
The pension funds have a very clear objective, and that is to serve the interests of the pensioners, who are a significant part of the workforce. But it's not necessarily the case that the pressure of pension funds for short-term performance will actually give them the best returns on their pension funds in the long term, which is what they should be interested in. So there is a question then in how you make the long-term objective of pension funds, which is clearly to earn very healthy profits over the lifetime of their obligations, which could be in many, many, many decades, how you reconcile that with the objectives they give to companies, which might be seen by companies as being, let's get the maximum published return in every given quarter. So the question is, are pension funds actually achieving their own aims as well as they could? And I think at the very least, we have a question on that.
So let's talk about how to fix capitalism. You wrote that you agree that, and I quote, capitalism is substantially broken and that we must reform capitalism. The role of finance is excessive. The interests of shareholders are given excessive weight over those of other stakeholders in corporations. Well, that's great, but who's going to do this? Who's going to fix this? The people and the entities that benefit from this status quo, who therefore have the resources and the influence, but not the motive? Or government? Or Main Street? Who exactly is going to restore capitalism to its proper purpose? And how do we do this?
I think that's the most difficult of all questions. And I think that we are very far from having a fully satisfactory answer to the question of how to go about reform. So I see this as having a number of very different elements. And I would not propose for a moment that there is a single solution to all this. And this is not a cop-out. This is because there isn't a single optimal solution. We're dealing with a very, very complex system, the market economy. We have institutions which have evolved over nearly 2 centuries, the corporation. These are very valuable institutions which do things we desperately need to have done. We are in a constant process, I think, of trial and error in finding out what works a bit better and what works less well. And what works at one period may not be what works at another period. And we have, above all, some really genuine trade-offs between the different objectives of a company and the different stakeholders interested in the behavior of the company. So it seems to me by its nature, we are in the world of trade-offs, and therefore there is no single overwhelming answer. That's the first and most important point. And the second very important point is that means we have to do quite a lot of experimentation within companies and within countries, and we have to see what works better and what works less well. So these are the two broad points I would make. Within that, these are the things that I would quite like to see happening. First, I think there are perfectly obvious ways we could go about reducing the instability generated by the financial system itself, and particularly by the instabilities of the credit system. The most obvious and important thing is to deleverage our economies, and one of the obvious ways of doing that is to eliminate the tax favoring of interest, which of course encourages leverage. And another thing we have to do is reduce the credit creation of the financial system, which is essentially the result of our willingness to accept extraordinarily high leverage within the financial sector. And again, that's something we need to look at very carefully. I discuss both of these things in my recent book on the crisis and its aftermath, and I do think the financial sector itself is a central part of our problem. Turning to the next thing we have to deal with, which is obviously corporate control and how that should work. The model we have adopted, at least in the US and UK and a number of other countries, is the purpose of the firm is to maximize the value of the firm to shareholders, and control rights are vested in shareholders. It is perfectly possible to imagine other mechanisms of control. We could have differential voting rights, for example, in companies, depending on how long shares are held, for how long a period the commitment to hold them exists into the future. You could imagine in the process that you would end up with a domination of voting rights in the hands of people who are very strongly committed to the company. But I think those sorts of opportunities should be looked at and exploited. We have examples of that already. We could imagine quite aggressive attempts to favor ownership of companies in which people work, or at least partial partial ownership of companies in which people work by employees. Some of these methods exist, but these could be greatly strengthened. We can imagine looking at structures like the dual boards in Germany, which seem to me to have been very successful in combining supervision of the company's main objectives while leaving management to operate effectively. That seems to be a very effective structure which people might want to try. So there isn't a single answer, but there are a lot of different partial answers which people should be experimenting with, and we should be seeing which sort of company in which sort of business works well. And I think that is the way I approach this now. As I said, there isn't a single solution, but what we can do is encourage a really vigorous competition among different forms of economic incentive and management and control structures. At the end of this, we might find out whether there are better ways of doing things.
Stephen Davis at Harvard Law School was in the audience when you gave your speech at the ICGN, when you advocated for encouraging 1,000 different flowers of governance and control to bloom. He strongly disagrees. His argument is essentially that we have already established good governance models, but they just aren't being enforced. Do you agree?
I can't say that it's completely obvious to me that that is the case. The dominant governance model in British and American capitalism is a fairly simplistic one, which is the objective being to serve the interests of these shareholders, who might be shareholders for a microsecond or a very short period. I think the incentives which are inherent in our current structure of governance and control rights are clearly highly imperfect, and it doesn't seem to me that this is a very good and satisfactory model, and we should be experimenting with different ones. There's tremendous resistance and dislike of some alternative model. So it doesn't seem to me clear. It doesn't seem to me at all clear that we have satisfactory models of governance at the moment and just aren't being implemented.
Martin, you wrote that real income stagnation over a longer period than any since the war is a fundamental political fact, and capitalism and democracy, the strain is showing. To maintain legitimacy, economic policy must seek to promote the interests of the many, not the few. But isn't this socialism?
No, it isn't. The market economy, which we call capitalism in its post-early 19th century form, is a social arrangement established in law, the corporation itself, with all the privileges of limited liability, which are enormous privileges, which somebody like Adam Smith found quite objectionable, was established and encouraged because it was seen, rightly I think, as a way to generate prosperity as widely shared as possible by harnessing incentives of people to innovate and rewarding them in the process, harnessing incentives to include essentially everybody in the market, so getting rid of barriers of status of various kinds, more recently, of course, of gender, and in the process generate a free, open, and prosperous society. And in the very broadest sense, looking at the history of the last couple of centuries and comparing it with previous periods, it's obvious that this has worked very, very well. But it has also periodically created huge crises within the system and crises of the system. And intelligent politics and policy making is always trying to respond to those crises through reforms. Some of those reforms have been in political institutions, creating things like social security, welfare programs to manage some of the risks people bear within the market economy. And some of them are, of course, reforms of the market economy itself. Financial regulation, for example. Environmental regulation is another. And, of course, changes in the law of companies. And such reforms are still perfectly compatible with the continued fact that the dominant driver of our economies remains the market economy, competition, choice, the rights of entry, innovation. These are the the drivers of our economy. But that's perfectly compatible with changing somewhat how particular institutions, which themselves have very mixed economy characteristics, like the joint stock corporation with limited liability, how that is actually treated within the system. So the answer to my mind is yes, this is still the market economy, it's still capitalism, it's still competition, it's still innovation, but in a somewhat different legal and operational context. And that ability to change the institutions of the market economy in response to political pressures, and vice versa, change the political institutions in response to social and economic pressures, that's what makes our societies dynamic and successful over the last 2 centuries. Right now, this isn't working very well. The market economy, as it has unfolded in the last 30, 40 years, is not satisfying a lot of people. There are many reasons for that, not just the way corporations are run. There are very big issues here. But in response to what's gone wrong, the financial crisis, the dissatisfaction with corporate governance, the shifts in income distribution, we have to ask ourselves, are these core institutions working as well as they should be? And if not, how should we reform them? To do anything else would, I think, be to betray our heritage and to betray the system of democratic politics, or increasingly democratic politics, and economic freedom, which is the core of the relatively successful, not perfect, developments of the last 2 centuries.
Who does capitalism belong to? And if it's Main Street, what obligation does Main Street have to fix it?
I think that the economic system, if I may rephrase the question, operating today is accountable to the population it serves. It's accountable to it in terms of its operation, as it were, within itself, in terms of its operation for the benefit of consumers, ultimately, and people even more broadly. And it's accountable to the people in exercising their power through politics, because the economy is fundamentally intertwined with the political system. They're not completely separate entities. So I would see it not as a matter of ownership, but as a matter of accountability and the management of making accountability effective. Always difficult. And in a global economic system, obviously enormously difficult. That, anyway, is how I see it. In the end, the economic system, like the political system, has to be accountable to the population it serves.
So unless Main Street makes a decision and realises that the responsibility starts with them, we can't expect any change, and Main Street is then part of the problem, perpetuating the status quo. So Main Street has a role in demanding action, right?
There are collective action problems always. It's a tremendous effort for individuals to do things, and individual acting won't make much difference. So they all have to get together, and getting lots of people to do something together, which is not directly in their interests, is always very hard. As Mansur Olson has pointed out many decades ago, it's very difficult for Main Street, which is a huge, gigantic collection of people, to get together to offset the concentrated interest of the business sector as a whole. If people are engaged as citizens, can make up for this to some degree, and groups of activists can be sufficiently motivated to ignore the collective action problems and get out there and do things, and that will make a difference. I'm not going to suggest there are some simple, straightforward processes which the population at large can exploit to change what seems the plutocratic development of our economies and polities. But I think it's not implausible that when there's a very widely shared sense that things aren't working ideally, when people come forward and suggest, well, there are reforms we could do which would really make a difference, and these are those reforms, and if they look sensible, it may be that a lot of people really campaign for them, and cumulatively you can make a difference. So I don't despair of the possibility of change.
So if capitalism is broken today, project forward 30 years or so, what do you think capitalism will look like then?
I really have no idea. I like the imagination for a really far-sighted view of the future. I think the most important point probably is the way technology is going to develop, which is immeasurably important in changing the way the economy and corporations behave, and has already been so in the last 40 years, deindustrialization, for example. A second hugely important issue is whether it will be possible to sustain a global form of market economy. And these two questions, how technology will evolve and how globalization, as we call it now, will evolve, seem to me at the moment two of the biggest. And then the third, I suppose, is the environmental context within which we're operating, particularly climate-related changes. Now, on the first, to me, the biggest issue is how radical will be the transformation of worker opportunities by the artificial intelligence and associated robotic revolution. We may possibly be at the beginning of a decisive shift against the value of human labor. Maybe human beings will go the way of horses. That's very, very extreme. If that's true, and serious people suggest it might be true, it will change everything in terms of the nature of our economies, economic systems, social relations, and so forth. On the second issue, globalization, we're moving into an era of superpower competition between the US and China, and that might tear apart the economy we've created. And the final question, of course, is how close are we to creating unmanageable climate change? And what is that going to mean for the world and political order?
But building a more powerful economic voice for Main Street in order to be able to better influence how capitalism moves forward and allows Main Street greater influence in terms of better shaping how these issues you've just talked about are actually dealt with is essential. I believe this includes more sharply identifying and focusing on our economic, not just our political representatives, such as state treasurers and state pension funds, who are custodians of our money, our pensions, and starting to put more pressure on them to face up to these issues more proactively in Main Street's favour, instead of sitting back and letting Wall Street drive capitalism oblivious to the needs of Main Street.
Yes, but I see that, and I'm writing about this at the moment, and I don't say I have an answer, but fundamentally, in the very broadest sense, that is the core question, which is how do we as citizens manage to govern, control our fate, rather than just abandoning it to automatic processes which are not necessarily fully satisfactory. This might require reforms which are quite profound, but I unfortunately don't have the answer exactly to how to do that. But I agree with you that we're not going to do that if we don't manage to make the voice of Main Street, as you call it, broadly more effective.
So there wasn't time to share this with Martin, but I do want to share these 4 points. Firstly, the great Jack Bogle, who was the greatest revolutionary on Wall Street in the last 50 years or so, and a lifelong committed servant to Main Street, otherwise known as the founder of Vanguard and index fund investing. He said, "Wall Street's portfolio managers are the most potent force in corporate America." Warren Buffett has also said that if you bring together the top 5 investors on an important issue, the world will change. In fact, that's what I've been doing over the last couple of years or so, and so I recently put on an event at the United Nations in New York about how to reverse economic inequality, for which I brought together a Nobel laureate economist as my keynote speaker, leading academics from Harvard Business School, some of the most esteemed economists in the world, together with state treasurers, state pension fund executives, the executive director of the Council of Institutional Investors, and I got the CFA Institute and UNPRI, which are the biggest institutional investor groups in the world, to partner with me, and McKinsey sponsored my event. In fact, the CFA Institute of New York said that I'd managed to bring the creme de la creme of the institutional investor community into one room, and even they had never been able to do that before. So I basically brought together the largest shareholders in the world, showed them how, via these top thinkers across business academia and leading economists, how they can reverse economic inequality. Now, the reason why they haven't yet implemented this solution is because I was the only voice asking them to, essentially, and that's obviously not enough. To reverse economic inequality through these powerful shareholders and investors requires your voices, Main Street. And this is a really important point. The state treasurers and state pension funds are huge assets for Main Street because, number one, they command a huge voice over the corporates because they are the perceived owners of these companies. Number 2, they are responsible for pension fund assets and thus accountable to pension fund beneficiaries and workers who have a state pension. And number 3, they are also accountable to taxpayers because it will be taxpayers who will have to bail out these state pension funds increasingly in future years and decades because of the massive pension underfunding crisis across the country. So that's a heck of a lot of power in your, Main Street's hands, which you're not yet tapping into and using. And that's what I'm doing here. Another really important point is understanding how change happens. And one of my favourite academics on this is Dr. Leandro Herrero, who is an executive fellow at the Centre for the Future of Organisations at the Drucker School of Management. And you should have a look at his viral change programme. Lastly, let me remind you of what Margaret Mead famously said. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does. Now, for the most important part of this show, how you, our listeners, can play your part. Philosopher Joseph de Maistre wrote, "Every nation gets the government it deserves." And we have the type of capitalism that we deserve. So if you don't like the warped, utterly dysfunctional version of capitalism that we have today, it's down to you and no one else to change it. All we ask you is to go to our website, yourcapitalism.com, and do some simple retweets there and other simple quick steps that you can take to help us fix economic inequality and capitalism. There is, after all, no alternative, because what we have today just isn't an option. Thank you so much.